Hello, on this video I'm going to talk about C++ iterators, and also I'm going to talk about a couple of functions that go very well with iterators and vectors. And now on Visual Studio I'm going to create a new project, C++ project, give it a name, and I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. And first thing I'm going to do is to include the vector, and then I'm going to include the using namespace standard. And now I can finally create my vector. So I'm going to create a vector of integers, and this vector is going to be called v, and then the values inside this vector. And now I can create the iterator. So to do that, the iterator is going to be type vector integer. So vector, then the word iterator, and then finally the name of my iterator, which is it. Alright, so the iterator is a object. In this case, it's an iterator that points to a vector of integers. So currently, the iterator is pointing nowhere. However, what if I want the iterator to point at the first item of my vector? In this case, there will be item number 10. To do that, I'm just going to put iterator equals the v, which is the vector, dot begin. So now the iterator is pointing at the first item of the vector, which is 10 in this case. So I can now display the iterator, but I cannot just display like that. I have to put the star right here in front so I can actually get the value that's pointing to. So it's pointing to the first element, and to get the value I'm going to put the star here. So now if I run this program, I want to get 10 because that's the first element. Now if I want to move to the second element, I can put iterator plus plus, and that now moves to the second element, which is 20. So if I run this program, I get 20, and I can also put plus equals, let's say 3, and that will add 3 to the iterator. So the beginning plus 3, there'll be 1, 2, 3. So now I'm going to have number 40 to print. So number 40 prints. And you can do the same thing. You can go backwards. So it minus equals 2. So that means you start on the beginning, then you go 3 to the right, and then you go 2 to the left. So now you end up with 20. So there it is, 20. So the iterator, you can keep on moving left and right however way you want. Now, when you call the function begin, it points to 10. However, there is another function called the end, and if we point to the end, you would think we're pointing to 50, but we're not. We're pointing to a number after 50. In other words, it's the end. So if you try to print the end, you're going to have an error. And that's because the end points to an item after the last item. So this is how you identify that you are out of bound already. So if you want to actually get the last element, you have to go to the end, and then you have to come back by 1 position. Then you end up with element 50. So now I get 50 on this code. So I really like to move the iterator using the dash dash or using the plus plus. That's my favorite way of moving the iterator. Or you can also put plus equals 2, for example, moves 2 at a time. So that's my favorite way to move. However, you can also use the standard function called previous, and that will move your iterator 1 to the left. So in this case here, we are at the end, and then I move 1 to the left, and now I save that to iterator, and now finally I can print the iterator, and that gives me the 50. So if you do this a couple of times, obviously you'll go back twice, and that ends up at 40. Now you can do the same thing. I'm gonna start at the beginning, and then after that, instead of using previous, I'm gonna use next, and that points to the next element. So instead of having 10 now, I'm gonna end up with 20, and so on. And you can also use the advance function, but if you use the advanced function, it does not return anything, and it wants you to put the number of position that you want to advance. So let's say here I want to advance by 2. So if that's the case, I start at 10, then 1, 2, end up at 30. And I can use the advance to go back to the left as well. So let's say here I am going to advance by -1. And if you print this iterator, then I'm going to end up with 30 and 20. So 30, because I moved 2 to the right from the beginning, so I end up with 30. And then I move 1 to the left from 30, so I end up with 20. All right, and you can also get the distance. So let's say, so right now the iterator is at the beginning plus position 2. So right now the iterator is at beginning plus position 2, 1, 2. So currently it is at 30. And what if I want to know the distance between 30 and, let's say, the ends of the vector? So if that's the case, I can create an integer distance equals, and I'm going to use the distance from the standard library. I don't really have to put std here. I could put just distance, and the reason I can do that is because I already have namespace standard right here on the top. And I'm gonna put the iterator, comma, then v dot end, because that's gonna give me the distance between the iterator position, which is at 30, and the end. So now it is pointing to 30. Remember, the end is one after the last item. So in this case here, even though I am at 30, so 30 from the end will be 1, 2, and 3. The distance from where I am right now to the end is 3, because the end, remember, is one after the last element. So if I print the distance now, I'm going to end up with 3. And I can also calculate the distance from the beginning. Right now, the iterator is pointing at 30, and the distance from 30 to the beginning will be only 2. Because remember, once you get the begin function, it returns you the position of the first element. So the distance from 30 to begin is only 2. So 2. Now I did get -2. Now if the negative bothers you, you can always change and put the iterator at the end, and that will give you a positive number. All right, 2. So now I'm gonna write a for loop just to display the items from the vector. Now, if I did not use the iterator, I would write something instead of length v dot size, which is the size of my vector, and then after that I'll display v vector and put the index of the vector. And now if I run this program, I get all the items from my vector. So this is how you do it without using the iterator. Now if you want to use the iterator, I would get the iterator right here, which is it equals the beginning of the vector, which is exactly what I have right here. So I'm just gonna cut this and paste it right here. And then while the iterator not equals the v dot end, remember the end is one after the last element. And then here I'm gonna do an increment on the iterator. So set the iterator to beginning, then your validation is going to be while the iterator is not the same as the end, and then the increment is it plus plus. And now when you display the iterator, I'm just going to display the iterator, and I'm going to place the star sign right here, and that should give me the actual value of where the iterator is pointing to. So now if I run this program, I should have exactly the same results that I had when I was running this without the iterator. So 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. So the same value. So next, I want to talk about copying vectors. So copying vectors is not directly related to iterators. However, it has a little bit of iterator feeling for me. And I'm going to show you what I meant in a second. So I'm going to create a function to print the vector for me because I don't want to type this many times. So right here at the bottom, I'm going to create a static display vector, and I'm going to pass a vector of integer as a parameter. And I'm going to write a for loop right here. And the for loop is going to be exactly what I had on the top. So now I can just call this function anytime I want, and I can display all the vector. All right, so let's go back to copying a vector. Now, copying the vector does not necessarily involve the iterator, but it goes together because of the end and the begin function, which can be pointed at by a iterator. So let's say I have two vectors. So vector v1 and vector v2. And the v2 is going to be 100, 200, 400, and 500. So now if I want to copy the vector, there's a couple of functions that I can use. So first I'm going to use the function called back inserter. So standard. Then I'm going to use the copy function. And with the copy function, I'm going to pass the vector. So in this case, v1 dot begin, comma, v1 dot end, and then comma, back inserter, and then finally where I want this to go, and then it's gonna be the v2. So when I do that, I'm saying from the beginning of vector 1 to the end of vector 1, in other words, every single item of vector 1, please put at the end of vector 2. So now if I use my function to display the vector 2, you're gonna see, forgot to define my function. So function defined, and now I can run this again. So now I have the vector 2, and then at the end of the vector 2, I have all the items from vector 1. So remember, I'm displaying only the vector 2 here. I'm not displaying the vector 1. So the back inserter inserts these items at the end of the vector. So now, nothing here involves the iterator, but I could put the iterator equals v1 dot begin, and then instead of the begin here, I can just put the iterator, and that iterator is pointing at the first item. So in that case, it would copy the whole thing and I would have exactly the same results. However, I can move the iterator a couple of items to the right. And if that's the case, then I'll be missing the 10 and 20. So I'll be copying only the 30, 40, and 50 because I'm moving this to the right by 2 positions. So the 10 and the 20 were not copied. And the same here with the ends. I could create another iterator that takes this to the end. So I can use the iterator 2 here. And I would have the same results as the previous run, unless you change the iterator 2 here. All right, and now I'm going to remove the back, and I'm going to just use inserter. However, this function requires us to pass another iterator right here. So I'm going to create a iterator number 3. And I'm going to put this at the beginning plus 2 positions. And I'm going to make sure that this is on the second vector. So now iterator 3 is pointing at the second vector plus 2 position. So it should be at number 100 plus 2. It should be pointing at 300. So I'm going to pass iterator number 3 here as a parameter. I'm going to remove this guy here for now, just because I want to copy the beginning of vector 1 to the end of vector 1. And I want to insert that on vector 2 starting at iterator number 3. And iterator number 3 is pointing at the second vector plus 2 position. So when I run this program, now I have the first vector, which is 100 and 200. And then at position number 3, you start inserting the elements of the first array, and then you pushed the elements of the second array to the right. So this is how you copy values on the middle of an array. So now I'm going to show you a way to do this copy. However, I want to overwrite the items on the second array instead of expanding it. I'm going to put a make move iterator on the first iterator or the first position. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the second position, so iterator 2. And I'm going to move this to the new line just so it's easier to see the entire code. And then for the last parameter, I'm just going to pass the iterator number 3. However, we're going to have an error right here because the iterator number 3 is at the beginning plus 2. In other words, it's pointing to 300. And the vector that I'm going to copy has 5 elements. So starting at 300, if I try to insert 5 elements right here, it's going to fail because it's going to replace the 300, 400, 500, and then the 40 and the 50 are not going to have any space on the second vector. So in other words, when you do this kind of copy, whatever you're starting from, in my case here, I'm starting from iterator 3, you have to have enough space to copy the entire thing. So if I run this program now, I'm going to have a problem. It crashes. Now to solve this problem, I either have to have a bigger second vector or a smaller first vector. So I'm going to copy a smaller range on the vector number 1. So on the vector number 1, I'm going to copy from the beginning. Then I'm going to copy from the beginning again. And I'm going to move 2 to the right. So now if I run this program, so I have no errors, and I copy the 2 elements from the first vector into the second vector. But if you notice right here, the 300 and the 400 got overwritten by the items that I copy. When you copy your vector, using this function and using the make move iterator, you lose some values because it doesn't resize your second vector and it overwrites with whatever items you're moving to the vector. Alright, so that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.